Hi everyone. Thanks, Ying. I'm here to tell you about a few ways that you may want to be thinking about the future today. I honestly think that we've learned from Catherine already a ton yesterday, and you're already, I think, a really good future thinker. So let's see if I can tell you anything new here. My name's Alison. I'm from Foresight Institute, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that selectively advances beneficial technologies. And we like to do that most collectively. So we have a bunch of different events that I all encourage you to join if you're in the Bay Area. For example, the upcoming one is on June 20, where we really focus on kind of like positive futures from AI in a way where we focus on what can we do cooperatively to reach those goals. And Ying will do a session on this one. Gaia will do a session there too. So there's a bunch of you already attending. If you want to attend, this is invitation only. Write me a message. And there's also a report from that out here from last year. If you're interested in taking a look, they will be over here. What we also do is we do a bunch of more public-facing events in which we collectively with a public group kind of brainstorm about a bunch of forward-looking themes. And we have everything on there from the hedonistic imperative to dissolving the Fermi paradox, longevity myth busting, and so on and so forth. Those are monthly events. And they're a little bit more public-facing. If you want to join those, then go to bit.ly/Foresight updates, and it's always a ton of fun. And many of you have been speakers here. For example, Peter Eckersley on the trajectory of civilization, which was a ton of fun. Anyways, we like to do this collaboratively and kind of overthinking about this a bunch, with a lot of people. I've then started this project called existentialhope.com. Which is based out of a really cool paper that came out of FHI. And basically what I've been trying to do is, what are the, mapping all of the projects out there that are working toward positive futures. So we have a lot of risk focus out there already, but sometimes it's really helpful to, think about where do we want to go. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir. Everyone here knows that that's why you're all here. But basically on that website, I try to map all of the different projects that are doing really good work in different areas that are important to our future, and I try to put them in different buckets, and it's all collaborative. So, if you are working on a project, that can be in any of those sectors, or tell me to open up a new bucket that should be on there, then please let me know. I'm also hoping that some of this can inform some of the thinking today. For example, the health technology sector may be relevant to some issues, and a few others. The AI one certainly is too. And currently where this project is that we've started condensing the different buckets into primers on the different areas. So we've now started interviewing domain experts on what would you tell a really bright, smart graduate student in the next generation to get them excited about good futures, and not only get them excited and promise them airy fairy lofty goals, but what are some concrete moonshots that they could be engaging in that they could rally behind to make the world a much better place for a bunch of generations to come. And we've started with Aubrey de Grey on health tech. We had Tom Chi, co-founder of Google X, on biosphere. And so the hope is that by having those long form interviews, we can condense them eventually in making primers, where someone isn't totally overwhelmed when they're thinking about hey, how can I plug in creating a better future, but where they have a good primer by our domain experts with pretty concrete goals. So that's what we're trying to do here. Maybe some of it is hopefully relevant, but then I've tried to concretize brainstorming about the future even more so over the last year, and I'm currently writing a book with Christine Peterson and Mark Miller on more concrete strategies of strengthening civilization. And this, what you're seeing, is not the book. This is a paper, and this is out here as well if you want to take a look. But a few of the ideas that are in the book are discussed in the paper. And given that we've spent every weekend in the past year really brainstorming hard about this, maybe there's a few ways that some of our processes can inspire some of your processes today. And so I want to go through a little bit about how we started thinking about this, and then draw 5 major heuristics that you could be using in the end. Okay, so first of all, I think when thinking about the future, it really helps to put ourselves into perspective and to see where are we coming from? Where are we now? To start thinking about where do we want to go? Okay, so let's start at the beginning. 14 billion years ago, approximately, we were crammed into a single point. 10 billion years ago, around the time, we were stars exploding into existence. 3 billion years ago, we were bacteria, we were alive. Thousands of years ago, we were all God's creations. A few 100 years ago, we had proved we were one species, that we're all descended from ape. 60 years ago or so, we had proved we're all human and declared that we're all entitled to the same human rights. And today, of course, we could tell a much bigger story, right? We could create this kind of culture shift that really kind of like moves us and identifies us. And the obvious question is, well, what's next? And I think that there's a bunch of different options on the table, and we'll be discussing a lot of them kind of in more detail in the groups. But, you know, just to kind of like map out the space of like, you know, the worst and the best possible world, here's Nietzsche with one option where we may want to be headed. He says, in some remote corner of the universe, there once was a star on which clever animals invented knowledge. After nature drew on a few best, the star grew old and the clever animals had to die. So that's like one of the options where we may be headed. And you're laughing, but like, you know, frankly, I think, you know, given much of the current like media focus, this is not one, you know, which is incredibly unlikely. Anyways, this is not what we want to talk about today. So let's talk about a potential different vision. Whether anyone else is out there or not, we are on our way. Expansion will proceed if we survive, because we are part of a living system and life tends to spread. Where goals change and complexity rules, limits need not bind us. New technologies will nurture new arts, and new arts will bring new standards. The possible seems room enough. And I think this is a really nice guiding theme for today, in the sense that, you know, we can really think about how technology change our standards of culture and art, and how do we like go to the next level from that, right? So here we go. Those are the two options on the table. And of course, I wasn't quite truthful. There's a bunch of stuff in between as well, and we're going to be discussing much more of that in the groups. But all I want you to take away from that, it seems like we're at this really crazy bottleneck right now, where our actions can really lead down into like becoming a cosmic cul-de-sac in like a Nietzschean way, or we can be this amazing force like spreading into the future. So I actually think that this bottleneck hypothesis has a ton of kind of like underappreciated kind of like urgency to it for three reasons. First of all, and this may seem somewhat esoteric to some of you, I actually think that the longer we live, the more and more we have to lose as a species, right? So I think, you know, any of the past generations have made so many sacrifices and investments, you know, in terms for us to live our really, really amazing lives already, that I think it would be a tremendous shame if that now all went to waste and we went down a Nietzschean path, right? If life had stopped at the level of bacteria 3 billion years ago, it would have been kind of a pity, but unavoidable. But if life stops now, it's not only a pity, you know, but we're really guilty, because different to bacteria, we have brains, we can make choices. That means we have to justify the choices that we make, right? So I think, you know, with every generation to come, there's just more and more to lose of this amazing evolutionary history that we have. Also, it may be on us, right? We don't know who else is out there right now and who could potentially, you know, spread this amazing life that we have out and do something fantastic with it in the universe. So let's just pretend it's us for now. And also, as Max Tegmark and Nick Bostrom and a few others point out, it seems like the time is now, right? For the first time in our cosmic history, we have really kind of like created the technologies for our destruction and our ascent in this very large scale. And I think Max Tegmark makes a good point. He says, like, you know, the situation is so unstable that he really doubts that we can dwell at this fork in the road for much longer than a century. So let's get going. And this is insanely urgent, not lastly, because the longer we wait, there's less and less to use. So it's not only that there's more and more to lose, it's not only that the time is now, but it's also that with, you know, every kind of like second in which we kind of like delay kind of like progress, we're losing more and more that we could be using to make more progress. How much? Well, here's an out there estimate. So with every second of delayed colonization of our local supercluster, you know, we're using potentially 100 trillion potential human beings per second. And that's just humanly embodied beings. It's a kind of like back of the envelope calculation that Bostrom makes in one of his papers. But here we go. That's just to like give you the crazy scale of our history and our potential future. So it seems, hey man, this is really important. Let's get this right. Not only for the next 10 years, but maybe possibly beyond, right? We have big goals. Are we acting that way? Not really. Robin Hanson calls our time dream time. He says, our time is a time of legend, when low delusion heroes and the strange rich clowns around them could most plausibly have changed the course of history, right? So this is, I think, the situation that we're in. And also, congratulations, you are the low delusion heroes. You, all the people in this room, Now that you know about this option that we're facing, you can all make a difference, right? And I think the next question becomes, before we run around and do all the things, you want to think really hard about the things that you're doing. There's a bunch of crucial considerations that if they were different, then whatever action you're taking may actually cause the opposite effect of what you're trying to do. So, I think it's really hard and important to get your world model right. And I think the limits that we're facing are not only epistemic, but as Brian alluded to yesterday, there's, a bunch of different value differences that we're facing. And I think values are really hard. They're really important because after all, they're the metrics at which we evaluate whether the things that we're doing are good or bad, right? So values are important and they're hard. And as soon as we, I think, talk about values and boil it down, I can only say, welcome to Weirdtopia. Things are going to get really weird, I think. I think if you look at kind of like the value differences, there's I think 3 major groups that you may want to be considering. One is, of course, very near term. Values differ across humans massively already, right? So we are created already in motion. We are already in I think life is a process and we're at a part of this process. And so I think that honestly, any moral intuition that we have, whether this is consequentialism, whether it's deontology or virtue ethics, all of those can be traced back to kind of some idiosyncratic feature about our current situation that we're in, whether it's culture or our society or whether it's our evolutionary history, right? So it's really hard to find a common ground by which to say, that some values are more worth than others. And I think what we could be hoping to do is individually use something like Rawls' moral reflective equilibrium, which is basically saying we can use rationality that given that we have certain moral intuitions about what is right or wrong, and someone tells us, that they're based on biases or something, we can try to do our very best to overcome them and to try to bring our moral intuitions more in coherence with what we think is right. But it's much, much harder to reach that agreement across all of humanity, right? That seems like a really hard goal to do. And Scott Alexander has this cool post on, well, is it really that hard to do? Maybe many of the value differences that we're facing in society are not actually that deep. Maybe it's just that, we all have, given that we share those evolutionary, the same evolutionary history, maybe we all have the same ultimate values, but they're differently crystallized because we live in very different cultures. But maybe there's a way, of how to again, achieve some coherence amongst them because we all at least, share some things that make us all human. And that is, I think, a concept that Eliezer Yudkowsky picks up in Coherent Extrapolated Volition. He basically says, well, maybe there's a way that we can extrapolate outward, how an ideal human would act if we were more the people than we wish we were, had grown up closer together and had more time to think about what we want to do. Well, maybe there is some hope, for some convergence across humans. That already, I think, seems pretty hard, right? But that's not even, the whole story really, right? Because values don't only differ across humans, but they also really differ across time, right? So just like the values of our medieval European peasant ancestors differs very much to the values that we're holding right now, the values of our fish ancestors differed massively to the values that we're holding right now. And so our values will differ massively from the values of future generations that may be so infinitely more capable than us, right? And I think this kind of brings up a few interesting questions. One is can we even lock our values in, given that those future entities may be much more powerful and capable, right? And then also, should we lock our values in if we could, right? So we're pretty happy that our fish ancestors haven't locked in their values and didn't have a mechanism to do that, and that we can still kind of have an open and deliberative process about this. So who says that now is the right time to do anything like that? Shouldn't we be much more humble and open toward future beings? When is the right time? That's already really hard. And that's still not the whole end of the story. Values also massively differ across systems, and they're obviously related, but Eliezer Yudkowsky again has this novella on Three Worlds Collide, where he basically imagines humans meeting this alien civilization in space, and aliens are baby eaters, and they're all totally appalled. Oh man, how can you eat your own babies? Until they figure out, well, that was actually the kind of evolutionarily evolved adaptive strategy. And according to the morals that the aliens are holding, actually baby eating is a very rational thing to do, right? And you all may say now, and I've seen some faces like, this is all total sci-fi, but if you think about it, like, we are already perceived like, people from a different party line just as those crazy baby eating aliens, right? Like, if you think about that, it really rings true on some level. So, I think it's not too far out, to really see that this could be a problem, especially if we create different mind architectures, for example, AIs that are so different to ours and don't really share our evolutionary kind of like conditions at all, right? So this is, I think, a really hard Pandora's box that I opened here. And like, I think in my group later, we're going to probably discussing that much more on self-transcendence. But, for now, I only want you to take away, well, this seems really, really hard to get right. Do we have to get it right in all groups? Maybe not. Maybe we can do something that like Eric already like wonderfully presented yesterday with Pareto-topia, which is very aligned with, something like, maybe we can create something like a utopia, which is more like a framework in which a diversity of utopias can have hold, right? And more concretely, perhaps maybe we can create a world in which different entities, whether they are human, AI, or other, can cooperate with each other voluntarily to reach their interests, whatever they may be. The idea here is kind of like, well, you and I, or like we all may differ wildly in the values that we're holding. Is there a way that we can at least kind of peacefully coexist with each other? But even better, is there a way that, even though we disagree massively on a few issues, are there ways in which we can cooperate to a mutual benefit without having to agree on our values? And can we try to find out which instances are those, and can we try to make them much more likely over time? And I think this kind of like heuristic has worked quite well over time, right? Not if every interaction that we're currently engaging is to all of our advantage, but over time, I think by enabling much more voluntary cooperation, we have already kind of like created a civilization that at least climbs Pareto preferred paths, right? I think Steven Pinker has this great book on Better Angels of Our Nature, where he like basically maps out the massive decline of violence, and where he talks about a few ways of how we actually became much more cooperative over time. And I think this is certainly correlated with us making major progress on a bunch of different factors that we care about. For example, the massive reduction in poverty. And it doesn't mean that we're there yet. I think Catherine had a really cool slide also from Our World in Data yesterday, where she was like, well, it seems like we're making much progress. It's still pretty terrible, or let's say at least very suboptimal. So, what can we do better in the future? But all I'm saying is that maybe we've already been doing something right, and we want to try to find out what that is and get much more like voluntary cooperation going and strengthen the system that we already have, right? Okay, so then once you think that, actually voluntary cooperation may be a really good kind of like neutral action framework to go, how do you derive actions from that? I think that there is like basically 3 ways you may want to be doing this. One is, well, you could decrease the risk of cooperation, right? And this is just a general action procedure, but like basically, I think what is hampering a lot of cooperation on the long run is that, we face massive like risks from cooperating, right? So currently there's still a bunch of violence out there, and this violence will in the future take both like physical form and digital form. And could we create something like computer security by which, given the fact that like many of our interactions in the future will be digitally, can we create just like massively better computer security to kind of like encapsulate ourselves from those violent interactions? Then on the other hand, against massive physical violence, could we create something that, may pan into the safety group that you're in, like, a multipolar active shield system by which basically you have like a decentralized kind of like surveillance system by which different entities monitor each other and keep each other in check, so that not one entity has the ability to cause massive harm on a large scale, and you want to do that encrypted to at least preserve some privacy. I'm not saying, that this is the way to go. I'm just saying, once you have like kind of like an action procedure, you can already try to limit kind of the interactions that you don't want very much. And this may be relevant for the safety group later. But, in order to like get a much more cooperative world, we don't only want to decrease the risks of cooperation, we also actively want to enable much more cooperation, right? So currently, if I'm trying to, let's say, like further my interests or, act according to my values, I can do that well with a lot of you folks in the room because I kind of trust you already. So I don't need to set up massive contracts. but there's a bunch of other people out there in this world that I may want to be cooperating with, right? And currently the only way I can do that really, because there's not that much trust, is via third parties that allow us kind of that do that, like contract monitoring and contract enforcement, which is really hard to do. So wouldn't it be great if we could have like smart contracting that would basically enable us, like a bunch of different entities, to really much more voluntarily engage in a much, much richer set of different action procedures with each other. So this is just another way of saying, well, you want to enable cooperation. Then lastly, are there ways that we can maybe enhance cooperation? Well, given the fact that, we want to decrease the actions that we don't want, we want to enable the ones that we want much more of, are there also ways in which we can put much better starting conditions in place? And that I think will, maybe hold true for some of the physiological needs that you'll be discussing, in which people feel already at a much more, let's say, better starting condition to be engaging in like the interactions that we want to be engaging in. And we talked a little bit yesterday about universal basic income. I think that there are better options out there to some extent. For example, and here's one that is a little bit out there, could you do something like a universal basic capital for improving starting conditions, where basically instead of trying to redistribute resources that are already distributed, in which case, you have like major, like a political backlash, could you instead go to a space where there are resources out there that haven't been distributed yet? Yes, there's a bunch of space out there, a bunch of space resources that are just waiting to be distributed. And if we don't distribute them, they will be distributed by default very soon on a cosmic timescale. So why not try to grab them and ensure that everyone who's currently alive can have a share of them, right? So why not try to grab a bunch of space resources and at least kind of like instantiate something by which we can already, and everyone there can trade on a universal basic capital, which is basically the expected value of that future value of those space resources. This may all sound really out there, and it may currently still be so, but like we have really long timelines to consider. We want to have the most positive future. That may take a while. So like start thinking like long time scales. Anyways, there's a bunch of objections to the specifics that I just mentioned, and I'm happy to talk about them if we have time for Q&A, but they're not so relevant to what you're doing today. I basically want you to take away like maybe 5 things that would be valuable when you go into your groups. One, going back to the bottleneck slide that I had at the beginning, deep time perspectives can really help to get context, right? They can really help, kind of opening up that window into the past may also open up that window into the future, right? And maybe you don't have to go all the way back, but it certainly helps to get some perspective. Secondly, I think that, we should be open to things getting really weird, right? I talked about a few value differences, but, given that we have very long timescales to consider, don't be scared of it getting weird when you do the group work. Then, maybe there's something to be said for doing a tabula rasa and building up from scratch, but also consider that the systems that we have in place right now, while they may be suboptimal, there may be some adaptive value to it, which is the reason why they're still around. So try to find out what that value is and try to build on that, rather than just tearing it down. Then if you derive actions, well, there's a few spaces where you may want to be looking for solutions. For example, you may want to be looking for solutions between existing options. For example, currently it seems that we're facing this dichotomy between either remaining in our semi-anarchic default condition by which small-scale actors can cause massive risk, or we may be moving to a world in which a large-scale actor monitors all small-scale actors, but both face problems. For example, if we remain with the way that we are, we have small-scale actors causing risk, but on the other hand, we don't really want a totalitarian government, that is gonna ultimately enforce our values. So is there something like a multipolar active shield, which is basically a decentralized system by which different entities monitor each other? That would have the payoff that, on the one hand, everyone is monitoring everyone, you don't have totalitarianism. On the other hand, you avoid the risk of small-scale actors causing massive harm. So this is just an example of sometimes, even though different solutions seem mutually exclusive, they may not be, and there may be space between them that gives room for hope. Then you may be looking for other types of solutions in technical advances. So I really enjoy going to conferences where I have no clue what they're talking about, because oftentimes I think that I'm facing a problem, but then I realize, no, actually a different sector has already solved this problem, right? And here I have the example of smart contracting, right? Or zero knowledge proofs. but like I'm always amazed by that there's many more solutions out there that me and my silo I'm just not aware of and that we could be using. So feel free to ask each other, like, hey, is this thing that I'm like pointing out, is this actually still even a problem? Like, do you know if someone has already solved this? And then again, like the third one is think about future game changers. So, I talked about distributing space resources. Well, this seems outlandish now, but like companies are already gearing up for doing that. And, given the fact that we are considering long time horizons, just think about more generally, like, is there something around the corner, like some technological enabler or like just some new action space from which you could draw a new solution in, right? We're not just only faced with more problems in the long run, but potentially also with more solutions. So this is just to like maybe open your perspective there. And then lastly, bunch of objections. Overall, I just want to say every actions that you have that you're embarking on will have opportunity costs. Be really lucid about the opportunity costs of the actions that you're currently embarking on. Be ready to make sacrifices and be pretty open and clear about the sacrifices that you're making. Those are my 5 lessons. Overall, I think it would be great if the general mindset while you're brainstorming could be this crazy mental bridge between, on the one hand, you want to act like an event planner who knows that Murphy's Law is true. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. You're trying to de-pessimize. But on the other hand, you also don't want to lose hope. You want to keep an open mind about like what's the action sphere or like what are the different solutions that you may want to be considering. So you still want to think like an entrepreneur, thinking the impossible as possible. So much for kind of like my quick run through here. More of the ideas will be in the book. Feel free to grab a copy of the paper. Again, we have this AGI meeting. Drop me in a note if you want to come. We have those monthly salons, which you're all welcome to if you're in town. And the way to sign up for those is at this link up there. And finally, please contribute to existentialhope.com. It's very, very much collaborative, and maybe it will help you somewhat doing brainstorming. But yeah, if any of this was too fast, contact me at a@foresight.org. I'm happy to chat, or just find me. I'll be here for the rest of today. Okay, thank you so much. Have an awesome day.